morning was ice cold, but the silence was colder. On January 21, 1793, in the heart of revolutionary Paris, 20,000 people gathered at what was once called Place Louis XV, now renamed Place de la Révolution. It was no longer a square of kings, but a stage for death. Towering in the center stood the guillotine, its blade gleaming, poised to sever not just a head, but a millennium of monarchy. Then came the sound, a thunderous roll of drums. A carriage rolled in. From it emerged a man not in royal robes, but in a plain white shirt. His face was pale, his step calm, his title erased. This was Louis Capet, formerly Louis XVI, King of France and Navarre, now a condemned citizen about to become the first European monarch executed by his own people. And what followed stunned the world. When the guards tried to bind his hands, he resisted with dignity. "Do what you are ordered, but do not bind me." The crowd leaned in. The air froze. Then came his final words. "I die innocent. I forgive those who are taking my life. May my blood never curse France." But as he spoke, the drums resumed, drowning out the king's voice, silencing royalty forever. Seconds later, the blade dropped, and with it, an entire world died. The man who had once been crowned with divine right now had his severed head held aloft like a trophy of the people. Some in the crowd dipped handkerchiefs in the king's blood. Others danced. The chant echoed across the square, "Long live the Republic." In that moment, the ancient idea that kings were untouchable, ordained by God, protected by tradition, was shattered. But how did it come to this? How did a soft-spoken locksmith, born into one of Europe's grandest thrones, end up with his neck on a wooden block while his people cheered to understand? We must go back before the blade fell, before the crown slipped, back to where the tragedy of Louis XVI truly began. He was born into opulence, but never belonged to it. Long before the chants of revolution echoed through the streets of Paris, before his name was spit with venom by a betrayed people, Louis Auguste was simply a shy boy with ink-stained fingers and a mind built for quiet puzzles, not crowns. Born on August 23, 1754, in the gilded halls of Versailles, he was the grandson of Louis XV and the second son of the Dauphin of France. That meant he was never supposed to be king. In fact, few in court took much interest in him. He was awkward, stammering, deeply introverted, an observer in a world of performers. He preferred solitude over salons, gears over gossip, and spent countless hours alone tinkering with locks in his personal workshop, hands deep in grease while nobles danced just down the hall. A king in waiting? No. He looked more like an apprentice, but fate is cruel to those unprepared for power. In 1765, his father died suddenly. Then, just years later, his older brother also passed. By sheer tragedy, young Louis Auguste became heir to one of the most powerful monarchies in Europe, a boy built for stillness, thrust into a future of turmoil. While his peers practiced diplomacy and military command, Louis mastered maps, metalwork, and moral philosophy. Versailles, however, was not a place that rewarded introspection. It demanded charm, performance, and manipulation skills he never learned. At just 15 years old, Louis was married off to the vivacious 14-year-old Archduchess of Austria, Marie Antoinette. It was a political match meant to seal an alliance, not a love story, and from the first night, it showed. The marriage went unconsummated for 7 long years, sparking whispers across Europe. Was the young Dauphin impotent, uninterested, broken? The truth was more complex, possibly a medical condition, perhaps simply youthful fear, but in the savage world of 18th century diplomacy, nuance was never welcome. While Louis hid in his workshop crafting locks, The courtiers crafted cruel jokes about his manhood. His wife, trapped in the same palace but in an entirely different world, sought escape through parties, fashion, and scandal. The distance between them was more than marital. It was emotional, cultural, existential. Still, for all his awkwardness, Louis Auguste had a good heart. He was deeply moral, surprisingly humble, and genuinely cared about the well-being of others. In his personal journals, he recorded his hopes not for glory, but for love and peace. "I want to be loved," he once wrote, "not by history, not by God, but by his people." Yet history has little mercy for gentle souls born into brutal roles. Even as he was crowned Louis XVI in 1774 at only 20 years old, the signs were there. During the coronation, legend says the crown slipped from his head, a haunting omen. He had inherited a throne soaked in grandeur, but also debt, corruption, and unrest. He was a king in name, but not in nature. The child who once found joy in solving mechanical puzzles was now tasked with untangling a kingdom on the brink of collapse. But the tools that made him kind reflection, gentleness, humility would soon be the very traits that made him weak in the eyes of revolution. Louis XVI's early life wasn't marked by ambition or arrogance. It was marked by hesitation, isolation, and quiet tragedy. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest irony of all. The boy who never wanted the crown became the symbol of monarchy's fall, not because he was tyrannical, but because he was unfit for a stage soaked in fire. He inherited a throne. What he really got was a time bomb. On May 10, 1774, Louis Auguste became Louis XVI, King of France and Navarre. He was just 20 years old. As tradition demanded, his coronation at Reims was a dazzling spectacle of ancient ritual incense, Latin chants, the anointing of sacred oils. But the grandeur masked something far more dangerous, a kingdom rotting from within. France wasn't a nation awaiting leadership. It was a collapsing cathedral of debt, injustice, and rage, held together with crumbling mortar and divine right. And at the center of it now stood a gentle, inexperienced man, more suited to making locks than navigating revolutions. From the start, Louis XVI wanted to be a different kind of king, not feared, but loved. His first diary entry after ascending the throne didn't speak of power or legacy. It simply read, "I want to make my people happy." But good intentions are no match for institutional rot. France was bankrupt, brought low by generations of extravagant spending and the massive debts from aiding the American Revolution. The nobility and clergy, making up less than 2% of the population, were exempt from taxes. Meanwhile, the peasantry and middle class were crushed under unbearable levies. It was a powder keg, and Louis, whether he knew it or not, had just lit the fuse. Still, he tried. He appointed forward-thinking ministers like Anne Robert-Jacques Turgot, who proposed radical reforms abolishing privilege, cutting court expenses, taxing the wealthy. Louis approved. But the nobility, sensing a threat to their centuries-old dominance, pushed back hard. Turgot was dismissed. His replacement, Jacques Necker, tried again, this time by publishing the royal accounts, exposing the monarchy's debt to the public for the first time. It was meant to build trust. Instead, it invited fury. Transparency didn't soften the blow, it magnified it. Meanwhile, Louis made progressive but quiet moves. He abolished torture in legal interrogations, attempted to end serfdom on crown lands, and showed an unusual interest in science and technology. These weren't the moves of a tyrant, they were the acts of a cautious reformer, someone trying to fix a machine while it was already on fire. But to the elite, he was meddling. To the masses, he was too slow. To the radicals, He was just another monarch pretending to change, while preserving the same broken system. At court, his credibility eroded further, thanks in part to the woman always at his side, Marie Antoinette. While Louis was mild and reserved, the Queen was flamboyant, impulsive, and often portrayed as frivolous. The press dubbed her Madame Deficit, blaming her for the country's financial ruin, regardless of accuracy. Her lavish lifestyle, real or exaggerated, became the face of everything wrong with absolutist France. And Louis, unable to control the narrative or his court, let it happen. His silence wasn't neutrality, it was surrender. The tragedy of this period wasn't that Louis did nothing. It's that he did too little, too late. Surrounded by enemies in velvet robes and chained by his own hesitation, he couldn't push through the structural changes that might have saved the monarchy. And with each failed reform, each dismissed minister, and each spike in bread prices, the people's patience began to rot. They didn't just lose faith in the crown, they began to see it as the enemy. Louis XVI didn't wear the mask of a tyrant, but in a time of hunger, inequality, and rising fury, even the gentlest monarch begins to look like a jailer. He wanted to be a king of peace, but France was preparing for war. A war not with another nation, but with the very institution he had just been crowned to defend. And the clock was ticking. The revolution didn't explode overnight, it crept in like a sickness, until France could no longer breathe. By the late 1780s, Louis XVI found himself presiding over a nation teetering on the edge of collapse. Reform had failed, trust was shattered, and the people were hungry not just for bread, but for justice. And when the bread disappeared, so did mercy. France had suffered through a series of devastating harvests. Crops failed. Grain prices soared. Bread, the daily staple for the poor, became a luxury. Families starved while aristocrats dined under chandeliers. And all the while, the king, isolated in Versailles, appeared either unwilling or unable to act. For the peasantry, it no longer mattered which. Hunger had a way of turning confusion into rage. In a last-ditch attempt to avoid financial ruin, Louis made a historic decision. He convened the Estates General in May 1789, a body that hadn't been summoned in 175 years. It was meant as a gesture of inclusion, a signal that he was listening. But instead, it opened the gates to political chaos. The Third Estate, representing 97% of the population, arrived demanding real power, not just ceremony. When the king and nobility resisted, the Third Estate broke away and formed the National Assembly, vowing to draft a constitution in the now famous tennis court oath. The age of absolute monarchy was cracking. Louis, advised by ultra-conservative nobles, panicked. Troops were stationed around Paris and Versailles, supposedly to maintain order, but to the people. It looked like preparation for a royal coup. Then came the spark on July 14, 1789, and enraged mobs stormed the Bastille. Though the prison held only 7 inmates, it represented something much larger: state tyranny, royal power, unaccountable violence. The people didn't just tear down a prison, they tore down an illusion. The king tried to contain the fallout. He appeared in Paris days later, wearing a revolutionary tricolor cockade on his hat. It was an attempt to reclaim the crowd. But symbolism without substance falls flat. The people cheered, but they didn't forget. Months later, in October, thousands of Parisian women, angry, starving, and fearless, marched to Versailles. They demanded bread. They demanded justice. They demanded the king. After a night of violence and chaos, the royal family was forced to leave their golden cage behind and move to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, no longer rulers, but prisoners in their own capital. For Louis, this was the beginning of the end. The man once crowned by divine right now walked under guard through angry streets lined with citizens who once called him father. The revolution had crossed a threshold. What began as protest had become movement uncontrolled, relentless, and hungry for more than reform. It wanted rebirth. It wanted the past erased. And Louis XVI, a man already struggling to keep up with history, was about to be buried by it. He didn't flee the palace, he fled history. In the summer of 1791, King Louis XVI, once crowned by divine right, climbed into a carriage under the cover of night, disguised as a servant, his queen dressed as a governess, his children concealed beneath shawls. The plan was desperate: slip across the border, rendezvous with royalist allies, and reclaim the throne with foreign help. But this wasn't just an escape, it was a confession. A confession that the revolution was no longer something he could ride out or manipulate. It was a force he feared, and now he was running from it. This episode, later known as the Flight to Varennes, would become one of the most humiliating spectacles in royal history. Despite the disguises and carefully plotted route, the escape was clumsy and overconfident. At a stop in the town of Saint-Menehould, a postmaster recognized the king's face. It was still on every coin in France. The alarm was raised. The carriage was intercepted just miles from the border. As the royal family was escorted back to Paris under heavy guard, the silence in the streets spoke louder than any mob. This wasn't just a failed escape, it was a public betrayal. Louis was no longer seen as a reluctant monarch navigating chaos. He was now viewed as a traitor who had tried to abandon his people in their hour of reckoning. Up to this point, many in France still believed in the possibility of a constitutional monarchy, a compromise between the old order and the new. But the attempted escape shattered that illusion. Trust is fragile, and Louis had broken it. The people watched their king ride away in the night, and they knew he had chosen a throne abroad over the streets of his own country. Whatever goodwill remained evaporated. Despite this colossal failure, Louis was not dethroned immediately. In a move that now seems almost naive, the newly formed National Assembly chose to preserve the monarchy in weakened form. In September 1791, Louis swore allegiance to a new constitution, accepting the title King of the French rather than King of France, a symbolic shift that stripped monarchy of its divine aura. He was no longer sovereign by God's will, but by the will of the people. But the mask was already slipping. The royal family, confined in the Tuileries Palace, was no longer a symbol of unity, but of contradiction. Publicly, Louis nodded to the revolution. Privately, he wrote letters to foreign monarchs begging for military intervention. What followed was a slow, painful erosion of his credibility. He was a man performing loyalty by day while conspiring by candlelight, and the revolutionaries were watching. The fall from power wasn't dramatic, it was suffocating. Louis didn't collapse in a coup or a violent overthrow. He simply sank, day by day, into irrelevance. Every word he said, every decree he signed, was met with suspicion. The revolution had changed everything, but Louis had changed nothing. And in a world that demanded transformation, silence and hesitation were no longer acts of neutrality. They were crimes. The moment his palace doors shattered, so did the illusion of kingship. On August 10, 1792, the revolution finally turned its full fury on Louis XVI. An armed mob, angry, desperate, and drunk on the promise of liberty, stormed the Tuileries Palace. They weren't just coming for a man, they were coming for a system. The Swiss guards, loyal to the king, were butchered in the chaos. Blood soaked the marble floors. Royal symbols were torn from the walls. And the king, he fled not to command, not to resist, but to hide. With his wife, his children, and his sister, Louis sought refuge in the nearby Legislative Assembly, surrendering himself to the very revolution that had once claimed to protect him. The King of France was now a political detainee. This wasn't a temporary fall from grace. This was the erasure of monarchy in real time. A month later, on September 21st, 1792, the National Convention officially abolished the monarchy. France declared itself a republic. The crown, the titles, the divine right all gone in a single vote. Louis XVI was no longer king. He was simply Louis Capet, a citizen stripped of his identity, his power, and his future. But the revolution didn't just want his title, it wanted his head. He and his family were confined to the Temple prison, a grim medieval tower that had once housed noble crusaders and now imprisoned the remnants of the Ancien Regime. The transition was more than physical. It was psychological. Versailles had echoed with courtly rituals and whispered intrigues. The Temple echoed with footsteps of jailers and the rattling of keys. The man who once slept beneath gilded ceilings now lay beneath stone, watched constantly, his letters censored, his movements restricted, his dignity eroded piece by piece. And yet, even here, Louis clung to the fragments of his royal identity. He taught his son lessons in history and religion. He tried to maintain composure, to remain a father, a husband, a brother, in a world that no longer recognized him as anything more than a symbol of tyranny. But symbols are dangerous in revolutions. They either inspire or they are destroyed. In December 1792, the revolution decided it was time for judgment. Louis was put on trial before the National Convention not as a man, but as a relic of oppression. He was charged with treason, accused of conspiring with foreign powers to overthrow the Republic. The evidence was damning secret letters, hidden documents, alliances with émigré nobles. But perhaps more damning than anything else was the simple fact that he had lost the people's trust. Still, Louis defended himself with calm dignity. His speech was measured, even noble. But his fate had already been sealed not in the courtroom, but in the hearts of a nation that no longer believed in kings. The vote was close, but decisive. Death, with no delay, no appeal, no sanctuary. In the cold walls of the Temple, Louis faced his final days not as a tyrant, but as a fallen man, one who had tried to stand still while the world changed around him. And now, that world was about to erase him for good. He was a king on trial, but it was the idea of monarchy that stood accused. In December 1792, Louis XVI, now stripped of all royal titles and known simply as Louis Capet, was brought before the National Convention to answer for crimes against the state. He entered not in robes, but in plain garments, not to be honored, but judged. In a revolutionary France, still raw with hunger, fear, and betrayal. His presence in the courtroom felt less like justice and more like vengeance draped in legality. The charges were sweeping high treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, attempts to subvert the revolution. The evidence, drawn from secret documents found in the Tuileries, left little room for defense. But what haunted the court more than paperwork was something deeper: the memory of famine, of failed promises, of a monarch who once tried to flee. Louis defended himself with quiet dignity, calmly refuting the charges and reminding the court that he had always acted in what he believed to be the nation's best interest. But the truth was no longer enough. Not in a hall where Jacobins roared and heads already rolled. His voice, once law, now barely echoed past the walls. On January 20th, 1793, the verdict was delivered death, with no reprieve. The vote had been close, but history does not remember the hesitation, only the blade. That night, Louis asked for one last meeting with his family. The room in the Temple prison where they reunited was heavy with silence and heartbreak. Marie Antoinette clutched his hands, tears streaming as she realized this would be their final moment. His daughter, Marie-Thérèse, wept uncontrollably, and young Louis Charles buried his face in his father's chest. Not yet old enough to understand the permanence of death, but old enough to feel abandonment. His sister, Madame Elizabeth, held back tears, offering prayers through trembling lips. It wasn't the farewell of a king, it was the goodbye of a father, a husband, a brother. And when the time came to leave, Louis looked them each in the eyes and whispered, "I will see you again tomorrow." He knew it was a lie, but sometimes lies are all that's left when truth becomes unbearable. He spent the final hours of his life in solemn reflection, taking communion, praying quietly, writing a final testament to his faith and family. As dawn broke over Paris, he stepped into the cold January morning, escorted by guards through streets that once shouted his name in reverence, now in anger. At the scaffold, he refused to be bound, asserting that he would meet death as a free man. The crowd stood frozen. The drums rolled. As he mounted the platform, he attempted to speak, "I die innocent. I forgive those who take my life." But the sound of revolution drums pounding like thunder drowned out his final words. Seconds later, the blade fell, and with it, the last breath of France's divine monarchy. His head fell into a basket, but his story never stopped echoing. Over 230 years after the guillotine silenced Louis XVI, his death remains one of the most haunting turning points in Western history. Not because he was the most tyrannical monarch, not because he waged wars or slaughtered innocents, but because he was the symbol of a dying world. A man crushed not by cruelty, but by history moving faster than he could. His execution marked the moment when the old world of kings and crowns, of bloodlines and divine right was decapitated in front of 20,000 citizens screaming for liberty. But the irony is painful. The same revolution that promised liberty would soon drown in paranoia, censorship, and mass executions. Within months, Robespierre, the very man who helped send Louis to the guillotine, would himself fall victim to the same blade. The revolution didn't just devour the king, it devoured its own children. To some, Louis XVI is still a villain, a symbol of excess, complacency, and privilege. But to others, especially modern historians, he represents something more tragic, a gentle man trapped in a brutal system, someone who tried to reform, but lacked the force of will and vision to lead in an age that demanded boldness. He was not evil, but he was indecisive. He didn't command power, he hesitated in its shadow. And that hesitation cost him his crown, his family, and his life. But what can we, in the 21st century, truly take from the fall of Louis XVI? First, leadership without conviction is dangerous. Louis wanted to be loved, not feared. But in times of crisis, affection is no substitute for action. Being passive in the face of injustice or chaos only makes you a bystander in your own downfall. In our lives, whether in leadership, work, or family, we cannot afford to wait for the storm to pass. We must act before the tide turns against us. Second, public trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. Louis lied to his people when he tried to flee. He preached loyalty but wrote letters to foreign monarchs begging for rescue. His fall teaches us that integrity isn't optional, it's foundational. You can lose everything and still recover, but if you lose trust, you're done. Third, history doesn't wait for you to catch up. Louis was a man of the past trying to survive in a future he couldn't understand. And that's a cautionary tale for all of us. The world changes fast. The question is, will you adapt? Or will you be remembered as the person who refused to evolve, even as the ground crumbled beneath your feet? In the end, Louis XVI's death wasn't just the end of a man, it was the symbolic death of the Middle Ages. A final breath before the world marched into the modern era, with all its chaos, hope, and contradictions. He didn't lose because he was cruel. He lost because he stood still while the world moved on. And in history, standing still is the most dangerous thing you can do. If this story made you feel something, shock, sympathy, or just curiosity, don't let it end here. Drop a comment below and tell us, was Louis XVI a victim, a villain, or something in between? Save this video if you want to revisit this pivotal moment in history, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story that changed the world forever.